Okay, moving on to conduct finance and facilities business, 5.1, population and enrollment forecast. Sara?
Thank you. So I am sharing with you a high-level summary of the report that was put together by Jerome McKibben and Associates. He is a demographer who has worked with hundreds, I'm sure, of districts all across the country with all sorts of different profiles and populations and demographics. And he has a really, really great reputation around his work. He, at this point, right now, is unable to travel, but certainly if the school committee had technical follow-up questions, I can do some research with him on those. But at this point in time, we did think that it would be helpful to at least lay out some of the basics of the enrollment forecast as we talk about facilities, and in upcoming meetings, you'll hear the facilities capacity assessment from the architect who used this report in terms of, kind of determining capacity over the next decade or so. There are a variety of assumptions that Dr. McKibben puts into his analysis. He works off of census data from 2010. He also looked at 2020 census data that is available. He looks at housing and housing trends. He looks at the fertility rate of the local community. He looks at migration out of the district. So for example, people moving out in various age groups, as well as population changes of people moving into the district. And then also builds in some assumptions based on things like gasoline prices and mortgages. So there's really far more than we could do internally. He really is an expert in this field. So in terms of the executive summary, I'll just turn to a couple bullet points. The resident total fertility rate for Barnstable district over the life of the forecast is below replacement level. This is not kind of unusual for Massachusetts, where they're looking at fewer children being born than people who are passing away, and so that is one of the sort of big takeaways of the summary. Most in-migration to the district continues to occur in the 0 to 9 and 25 to 44-year-old age groups. Probably not a huge surprise given some of the trends that we've been seeing, where we are having a lot of newcomers to our schools enter in our elementary schools. I should also note that one of the data points that he based this off of is recent 5-year trends in our enrollment. The local 18 to 24-year-old population continues to leave the district, going to college or other urbanized areas. This is the largest segment of the district's outmigration. It will grow steadily over the next 10 years is his prediction. And the second largest outmigration is in the 70-plus age category. There will be a slowing increase of empty nest households, no children at home, and a relatively high number of elderly housing units turning over, coupled with a steady in-migration of young families accounts for district enrollment increasing after the 27-28 year. And changes in year-to-year enrollment after 2027 will primarily be to larger cohorts entering and moving through the school system in conjunction with smaller cohorts leaving the system. Big summary, the elementary enrollment is predicted or forecasted to slowly increase over most of the next 10 years. The median age of the district's population will increase from 47.1 to 47.9. Even if the district continues to have some amount of annual new housing unit construction over the next 10 years, the rate, magnitude, and price of existing home sales will become the increasingly dominant factor affecting the amount of population and enrollment change. Total district enrollment is forecasted to decrease by 40 students between 22-23, which is last year, and 2027 to 2028. But after that, the increase is forecasted to increase by 78 students, or 1.7% for the remaining 5 years. And not contained in the report, but in a follow-up conversation that I had with him, and I'm not sure if the 75% is in Massachusetts or if it's nationwide, but 75% of districts will be experiencing enrollment decreases over the next decade. And I just added that because I thought that it would put what I would say is maybe a relatively flat enrollment over the next decade to be kind of an anomaly compared to other districts where there's just a lot of there's fewer children in schools. I know that the Northeast and the Midwest, in my conversations with him, are particular areas where this is happening to a greater extent than other parts of the country. So here are some of the numbers. This is elementary in terms of the forecast, and I have it broken down by school as well. But if you look at the red, which was last year, we had, at the time of this report, 1,532 students total in K through 3. And that's predicted to dip a bit and then start to increase again by the end of the forecast at 1,559. And BUE, grades 4, 5, 735 students last year. That is predicted to increase because we've been seeing more students come in at the K-3 level than previous years, up to 787 in 27-28, but then decrease slightly after that. I'm going to back up one step. He did not include preschool. Preschool is kind of assumed to be somewhat fixed, and we're limited by our space, and so preschool is kind of predicted to remain kind of fixed unless we were to make any changes. We do have more, I think, demand for preschool than we can currently accommodate, so that may be something to look at in the future. BIS last year was 651, and that is predicted to increase over the next 5 years, or maybe a little bit more, up to 717, but then dip down, but still be an overall increase by the end of the forecast decade to 685. And then the high school, I had mentioned this previously when we were talking about JROTC, and this is not due to anything wildly dramatic. I think we're looking at just smaller groups coming in, and we're graduating larger groups of seniors that are coming in 8th to 9th grade. So a dip there will alleviate some of our space pressures at the high school, but then it is predicted to increase again to 1721 in the 2032-2033 range. And so total K to 12, again, this doesn't include pre-K, last year was 4,680, and by the end of the decade that's being forecasted is 4,718. The consultant is and has been open to kind of analyzing his work in subsequent years, and so we can send him our enrollment this October 1 and have him do a bit of an analysis and comparison to kind of keep track. What I found in using him previously is that he was pretty accurate, at least in the early years of the forecast in Franklin. Variables change. If any of those assumptions don't hold, could potentially do another forecast to see how that would affect enrollment. But the bottom line, I think, is some fluctuations here and there, but overall in the district, pretty steady. Getting to the school level, I think that's where we see maybe some things to be paying attention to, and this is a little bit of a preview in advance of the capacity assessment. All throughout, BCIS was assumed to remain the same. It's a special program as an innovation school, and so class sizes and enrollment was assumed to remain the same. BWB is an area, it's forecast to increase from 264 to 290 over the next decade, And we're already experiencing some space pressures there. Has not gotten as much attention or concern as High West and BCIS, but we're starting to feel space constraints at BWB, and I'm interested to see what the architect has to say about that. Again, we referenced space mining. That's something that we want to do this year, and we have a consultant built into the FY24 budget to help us make sense of what action steps we might want to take in the short versus long term. Centerville is also forecast to increase from 247 to 262 over the next decade. High West has a forecast to decrease slightly and then increase again after that over the next decade, although I would point out Hyannis West has some of the more variable enrollment in terms of people moving out of the district and then people moving into the district. West Villages is forecasted to decrease from 401 to 371 and then increase to 384 for an overall increase across K-3 from 1532 to 1559. I would note too that, and I would expect that although our enrollment is remaining steady, the similar trend that we've seen in recent history is that we have more and varied needs among our student population, which necessitates the use of space differently and more staff. So although the forecast is relatively flat, I could reasonably predict that we'll continue to have students with more significant special needs, more English learners, if the trends hold from what we've been seeing. And it's not just us, it's everywhere, trends that we've been seeing in school-age populations. BUE, we talked about BUE, BIS, and BHS already because those numbers were in those graphs and were more specific, so I'm going to shortchange them here. I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you have. I may, for full disclosure, not be able to answer them all, especially if it's very technical on the methodology here, but happy to take any questions and look forward to your comments.
Any questions or comments?
I do.
Yep.
Looking at the population at the high school, that's interesting to me that it would dip down into the 1600s over some years. This is a school building that held well over 2,000 students, and going back, some years in the there was a time where Barnstable had to have double sessions because of the amount of students that we had. So, a Barnstable High School with 1,600 students, I think that to me, that says we're going to have, if it gets to that number, even though you have more specialized programs for special education, ELL, so on and forth, but that's a rather low number for Barnstable High School, given the size of the building. So is that going to, we can repurpose, that's what it seems to me going forward. Now, I know this is a 10-year forecast, and that's some time, but a Barnstable High School with 1,600 students, I look at what's been done, that would give us some optionality. There's been discussions about the culinary arts program and how that program can grow and what it could include. I look at how the wrestling program has taken space in what used to be classrooms. Those were history classrooms. If I look back in terms of my own journey through the high school. So not just in terms of some of the incoming programs, I think going forward we might have some, or we will have some opportunities to use a term that Mike Lambros used, space mining, to do some things that are innovative. If our numbers, again, go to 1,600 for a school that for many years was well over 2,000.
Anybody else? I would have just, once again, I go back to my pathways. We're just going to, we hopefully will have the room. But I also want to caution that this is only kind of half the report because this is the population. There's no, as you were talking about the ELL population and higher needs, and the fact you have to do smaller classrooms and more individualized learning or smaller groups, and if it takes more people, more room, all of that. Is there, and I understand we're going to have the one with the space needs, I get that too. Is there any way, is there any report that you can get where you kind of look with, I don't know, the amount of room like it takes to educate kids nowadays? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I understand we're going to have space, and maybe that'll be the space needs report. I really want to see that, because maybe that will, like, but you know what I mean? Like, okay, this is the numbers, but we all say that it's more people to educate in smaller groups, so you need more classrooms, because when you used to have a classroom with 35 kids, now you may have 3 classrooms with 10, because that's how they have to learn. So is there any way to kind of take the numbers, take the way we educate kids nowadays, and kind of put it together?
It would
You know
be
what I'm
my-
asking? I
yeah,
know that's kind of a non-educational way. It's a dad way, but like, is there a way to do that?
Yeah, I'm eager to see the capacity assessment report as well, and the architect isn't solely running the analysis based on numbers, which would be a concern. Like, if they were looking at the MSBA standards for classrooms, that's actually a really, really tight standard for how much square footage is allotted for a
Right.
student, without necessarily taking into consideration
Right.
some of these other variables. He did spend considerable time with our principals, with central office leadership, to talk about students.
So is his
and
report going
student
to show that?
services.
Like, I mean, we have this conversation all the time about how our numbers are going down, our budget's going up. It's the same conversation I've had for 8 years. So my question is, but like I said, back when I was a kid, you used to have a classroom with 30 kids in it. You don't have a lot of class. You have a lot more classrooms with small groups. A teacher in ELL at High West, you now have 5 ELL teachers you didn't have when I was a kid. So they don't take out 30 kids at a time. They have to work in small groups. That's just the way they learn the best, and that's what's best for our kids. So what takes that into account versus this doesn't take that into account? So how do we
I think
get the
we need to
message
see-
out there and just keep banging my head against the wall saying this is what education is nowadays? Is there some report that it's a third party versus me or you saying this? Is there a third party that would put to show what really happens in our schools and the way kids nowadays are really educated more? I would guess more kids are educated in small groups than there are kids in 25 kid classrooms. You know what I mean?
I think we'll have to see the assessment, the capacity report that the architect puts together,
Okay.
and if that analysis isn't there, consider.
I'm just,
you know,
is there an
considering-
in the education world, is there any way that puts that all together?
Not that I've seen. Not that
Well,
I've
there's a new
seen,
business.
but it's the same. It's happening across districts. I think it's happening.
Well, it's
more
because the thing
acutely
is
here,
people
but-
that I'm 49 years old, so it's people me making decisions who are thinking about it when I was a kid, and education just is not the same as when I was a kid. You didn't have. I was pulled out for the resource room. When I was a kid, you were pulled out for the entire day. I was in the resource room for the entire day, but there was only there was probably 5 of us in a special room. Nowadays, there is no resource room. Kids are pulled out individually, and there's 5 kids here and 5 kids there, and it's just different. It's just completely different, and you have people making decisions now, thinking about it when I was a kid, and most kids just stayed in the normal classroom. There was very few of us that got pulled out. Now, kids are pulled out all the time for extra help, where I was one of 5. So I just think that the people that are making the decisions, it's not about when you were a kid.
Right.
It's about the way education is done now. Right. And that I find very, very frustrating. So we need to come up with somebody that can show what, as a third party, not people that are sitting here, but people that's a third party where we pay some consultant to come in because they'll listen to them and do that. So, okay, I'll get off my soapbox. Thank you.
Mike, just to that point, I think it's a point that's very well taken in terms of, I teach history. I'm a member of the Barnstable Athletic Hall of Fame. I'm a graduate of the high school. And so the conversations, back to your point, when we talk about changes, in the district, what sports league we compete in, it's, if you talk to a Barnstable graduate who graduated in 1988 or 1995 or 2000, like I did, or 2010,
Right.
And they're thinking in those terms.
I know that. I am too.
I'm thinking
yeah,
in
we all
those
are.
terms.
Right. I'm not saying that's bad, but
no,
we need to
exactly.
educate the
I
way
think that's
education.
what we're saying. Again, for
Right.
me, I see 1600 Barnstable High School, And the trend,
Right, it's not-
the data is wonderful, and it's helpful, and it's clarifying, and I appreciate that. But to your point,
It's not the 1,600 that when you were there, or when I was at my high school or my elementary
and
school.
then the greater community, back to
Right.
what you deal with,
Right.
people say numbers are down, budgets are up,
Right.
you know, and it's not my kid, you know, but we do need these funds in order to make sure that these kids are successful,
Right.
like you were. And it's,
Right.
I think that conversation, to your point, as you said, would alleviate and
It's frustrating
would be
'cause
very
it's like-
helpful in the community. I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I get it because that's the way we all look at it from when we were kids, and it's just not the same as when I was a kid. It's just elementary school when I was a kid. Like I said, they pulled us all out. They put us in one room. There was 20 of us in one room, and I didn't really get educated that much, and it was just a place to keep me safe. And now we're actually taking kids and educating them. You know what I mean? So it's just different, and there's resources that need to be to educate me. You know, and that's what frustrates me is people just take it back from when they were a kid, and it's just changed. So that's my whole point. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Moving on to 5 point. Oh, is there anybody else that had any questions or anything? Peter or Kathy? No, you guys are all set. Okay. Moving on to 5.2.